Thank you. Okay, I'm looking for one more passage here that I neglected to write down. There is a reference. I just need somebody to look this up and see if you can find this for me. Let me just assign one person, and that way there's only one distracted person in the room. Kate, would you see if you can find the passage where it talks about God having tread his enemies in a winepress? Unless you just know off the top of your head where that is. Okay, yeah, help me find that one, please. Okay, so two things that we're going to try to cover today. One is the wrath of God, and one is the providence of God. Now, here's the interesting thing about starting the topic of the wrath of God. Every time that the wrath of God is talked about, someone says, no one likes to talk about the wrath of God. And then we go on and do it, okay? And that may be true. It's interesting to me, though, if I think of all the times that I've heard that no one likes to talk about the wrath of God, the next thing I've always done is sit in a conversation where we talk about the wrath of God. So there is something, I think, where we understand this is an inherently valuable topic, okay? It does actually matter whether we like to talk about it or not. And quite frankly, I've grown up, I'm grateful for this, with people, and I've been around people for most of my life that are comfortable talking about this concept because we see the tremendous value in a concept like this. Is it unpleasant? Yes, maybe. There are other unpleasant things in the scriptures as well, but we see the tremendous value in the whole of the Word of God. Okay, and so in talking about this, I hope that it's not one of those topics where we feel squeamish or we feel like we have to avoid something weird, in talking about this. It fits perfectly with a whole understanding of God, with a holistic understanding of God. And so it's not in any way off the beaten path. It may be unpleasant to some, and there may be some people that will avoid this topic in a broader sense of all that is called Christian in this world, okay? Not meaning your family name, but like Christian people, you know what I mean? Okay. But again, I'm grateful to have grown up with people that were intent on teaching me the wholeness of Scripture and the wholeness of God. And so this is an important part of that I think we have to understand. So let's start with kind of three concepts about the wrath of God. These are not necessarily in the same order as the book, but if you read the book or if you're scanning through it right now, you'll see how these fit in there. So number one, first thing I want to point out about the wrath of God is that it is properly a scary topic, okay? And it should be that if discussed properly. It should be something that is properly scary for us, okay? Several places could be pointed to talk about this. The Revelation, there's a phrase John uses at one point where he talks about God approaching his people in his fierce wrath. Romans chapter 11, verse 22, we have that little admonition from Paul to note then the kindness and the severity of God. Okay, he wants both to be part of our picture of how we understand him. There are all those passages where it's just talked about people that they disobeyed or they were unfaithful or they were incompletely faithful to God, and his wrath burned hot against them in some way, and they either suffered at his destructive powers or they were some promise that he had made to them, they negated it and he took it away and he left them without the good things he had promised them in his wrath. We're going to get to this in a couple of weeks, and we're going to make a little mention of it in the sermon this morning, but the plagues on Egypt. The plagues on Egypt. 10 rounds of just incredible disaster after disaster after disaster that were inflicted on Egypt. And why? To show his power, okay? And to show his character. Okay, now that's an interesting way to say that. In what way do the plagues show his character? Put it in these terms. In what way do they show his character? It's obviously a demonstration of his wrath, but why is he so wrathful toward the Egyptians? Okay, he's God and he's omnipotent, and so there's almost a sense of like the Greek gods. They can sort of do to humans whatever they want to do to humans and just show who they are. But he's not like that. He doesn't just toy with humanity. What did you say? Okay, the Egyptians would not listen. Specifically Pharaoh. The responsibility is always put on the chief leader, okay? But the Egyptians would not listen to the words spoken by the Almighty God. And more than that, one of the ways that they would not listen was this oppressive slavery that they've put on another people group. God is always wrathful against that sort of thing. People that oppress sojourners and slaves and widows and orphans, that sort of thing always garners the wrath of God in some way or another. And so, of course, the plagues are sent on Egypt, which is a very scary thing if you picture yourself standing there living as an Egyptian close to any of the capital city area where this all happened, where this all was like the epicenter of all of this. It's very scary. But it's because the wrath of God was due in that case. Rod, what were you going to say?
Just that it's a reflection of his being just and being righteous, being fair.
Yes.
His wrath is not a negative. It's a part of, if there's going to be a fairness and a just system, there's got to be punishment. And God's wrath is certainly comes because of that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, let me go Mickey, then Josh, and then Kate. I need that passage if you found it. Okay, what you have, brother?
Because of their confidence in their God.
Yes. Yes.
Passage I have there. Well, it's Revelation 19:15.
Yeah.
Might be Revelation 14.
Yeah, okay. It's actually kind of a semi-common image used throughout Scripture. Well, I say that. John is forever picking up on imagery from the prophets before him. Okay, so that's probably what's happening there. But yeah, this imagery of God, there's this scene where he walks into the room, and where God walks into a room, and a prophet says, "God, what is the blood all over your clothing? What happened?" You know, which is, of course, what anybody would do if somebody walks in with blood all over their clothing. Is, what in the world happened? And he says, "I have just come from the winepress where I was treading out my enemies in my wrath." Whoa, you know, like a winepress, you get out of that thing, you're going to be covered with grape juice. Okay, it totally makes sense because you're smashing them. Okay, picture that imagery and it's humanity in there instead of grapes. And God is treading out the winepress of his wrath. You know what I mean? Makes sense, actually, the song lyrics. Yeah, I can't even start it, but I know which song I'm trying. It's Battle Hymn of the Republic. How does it actually go? How does it actually go? Yeah. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Okay. It's a riff on that same imagery from Revelation. Where did you find it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, gotcha. Makes sense again. John and the other prophets, they do that. Okay, so all that to say, sorry, Josh, you were next. I'm not ready to keep moving yet.
I was just going to say on the properly scary, it's not just that there were these consequences that he did because they weren't listening. They were well thought out consequences. They were
Yes.
giving messages, I'm more powerful than your gods.
Yes.
I'm more powerful than your Pharaoh. I'm more powerful than this. And they also have benefits to the people. It institutes the Passover. There's a whole bunch of well thought out consequences. So it's not just properly scary. It's also implementing something that's beneficial to the people that he's promising.
Absolutely. Okay, this is the thing. God's wrath is the other side of the coin of God's goodness. They are the same coin because the coin is his nature. And it's not two opposite natures that have somehow been meshed together. It's one kind of rightness that depending on where you are, you'll see one side of that coin or the other. But it depends on where you are spiritually, not just the mood he's in.
And God is unchanging.
And that, yep, exactly. Okay, so I just wanted to make this point and actually meant to move on quicker than I actually did. So here we go. But it is properly scary, okay? And so this is one of those deals, again, if there is a tendency among us to say, well, let's talk about the wrath of God, but let's be honest, it's not all that bad as people make it sound. It's probably worse than people make it sound, and we need to be okay with that because that's who he is, and that's how things work in a relationship with him. There are things about the wrath of God that should properly scare us. I thought it was really healthy. No, sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The workbook writer makes a note about that I think is really healthy. But let's just kind of embrace that idea for just a second. Now, here's the thing that makes that sensible and actually, as Josh points out, somewhat comforting. and a lot of you have already made reference to this, God's wrath is also properly right, or you could say properly righteous, okay? And that's the idea that I think the workbook writer, there was one quote that I just thought was so immensely helpful on page 103. This is actually in the middle of another quote, I guess, but look at the second paragraph, the third sentence. God's wrath is his resentment against sin. Okay, now that is a really helpful description, I think, that helps us to maintain a view that it's properly scary, because if sin is there, and if we are the sinner standing too boldly and too proudly and arrogantly in the presence of God, then we should be scared of his fierce wrath. But it makes sense that he would have this fierce wrath because sin is in his perfect world. And he resents that. And he has given so much of himself to do away with it. It totally makes sense that his wrath would be inflicted and unleashed on things and people that are arrogantly sinful, because it's just part of him being righteous. I think that's a really helpful. That may have been the most helpful phrasing for me in understanding something that I guess I sort of got it, but I wasn't sure I could articulate it. And this is a good way to articulate it. Okay, and then add to that, I think a nuance to that point is that God's wrath, we need to understand, is properly controlled. Okay, there's a major difference, and you've probably thought about this and heard about this many times in different Bible classes, but there is a major difference between the anger of mankind and the anger of God. I think one of the key differentiators between the anger of mankind and the anger of God is the level of control that is exhibited. Okay? Take your pick of the times where God was angry with his people. Would you ever say, whether it's the plague, sin against the people in David's time, or it's the plagues against Egypt, or it's the refusal to let them into the land even after they've repented of their unfaithfulness to him, or whatever it is, would you say that God's anger ever got the best of him? No, thank you. Thanks for saying it boldly.
Well, it means that I think of Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah.
because he allowed Abraham
Mm-hmm.
to ask,
Yep.
if I can find,
Yep.
will you spare?
Yeah. And it wasn't, and so there is that slow to anger demonstration right there in that conversation with Abraham, which is a major part of his anger, of understanding it properly. But to your point, which side of the coin are they on? They are fully on the side where they deserve his wrath. So much so that Abraham can't find enough people to, barter their salvation. Okay, so there's that. Okay, let me ask this question, then I'll come right back to you, Marcus. So I asked you that about God. Would you ever say that his anger got the best of him? In your moments of anger, would you ever say that your anger got the best of you? Yeah. And what we mean by that phrase is that we have lost control of our rational faculties, and we have given them over to our emotional faculties more than we should. Maybe not fully, but more than we should, And that's the difference between our anger and the anger of God. And by the way, that little reference to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 20 right there, that's in the section on the fruits of the Spirit and the works of the flesh. And one of the works of the flesh that shows that you're living according to the flesh is your fits of anger. Well, doesn't God have fits of anger? Yes, but I wouldn't call them fits, because I think fits implies there is a lack of control. And God's wrath is always delivered in perfect measure and perfect timing. Tell me you're capable of that. You're not. We're not. And so that's one of the differences here, that his anger is on purpose, for a purpose, and it's a major difference between the way that we think about our own and his. Okay, Marcus, what you have? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. For being mad. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Okay, two passages that I just want to kind of quickly draw to mind for you, and then I'm going to keep moving so we have time for everything else. But number one is in Hebrews chapter 12, and really all throughout Hebrews, but particularly in Hebrews, we have these references talking about where God in his wrath would not allow the Israelites to enter into rest. Let us be careful, therefore, so we don't fall into the same kind of condemnation, right? But how long was the runway for the Israelites? It was pretty stinking long, and they just kept asking for more and more and more of it. And again, we have to make sure that we're not doing that and testing the wrath of God. The other one that I wanted to draw to mind for you is not Ezekiel, Exodus 34, where God describes his nature in verse 6 and everything after that. And he says that he is a God who is slow to anger and merciful and full of grace and all these different things, but who will by no means clear the guilty, and who will visit the iniquity on the next generation and next. You know what I mean? So again, two sides, and both of them are right because it's him. Okay? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. Yep. There it is again, the slowness to his anger. Okay. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here, that by the way was the initial slide that I had made for this section, and then I changed it and forgot to remove it. So now you know. So the other thing that I wanted to point out here, I think the big struggle, and I think the reason why this topic can get so uncomfortable is the fear of his wrath being inflicted on me. And that's one of the reasons that I think sometimes we're tempted to downplay it, is because we either know or we unthinkingly fear that maybe we have used up all of the runway, as Marcus put it, that he's given us. And so we try to mess with the topic itself so that it's not so uncomfortable or so compelling to make us change our ways or to make us fear for what we have deserved, And obviously that's a wrong technique. That's a wrong way to handle this topic. But I just think that it's at least worth admitting that because there is a comfort and a solution to this, okay? And the solution is exactly what Josh pointed out a little while ago, that all the expectations and the outcomes have been made clear. So are you afraid of the wrath of God? Well, go find out if you need to be or not, And I do think there's something important in that. He has given us the expectations for life and words and thought and heart and action and all these different things. He has given us what he's expected of us, told us the outcomes that will be on this side of that or on this side of that, and it's up to us to how we're going to handle that. We actually had this discussion in the car on the way here this morning with one of our kids. I was like, buddy, one of the kids was really mad at me because I had inflicted a punishment on him just this morning, but he deserved it. He did. And I was like, are you mad at me? And he goes, yes. And so Caitlin and I were sitting in the front seat going, okay, whose fault is it that this happened to you? It's mine, that whole thing. It's the same. It's the same with the wrath of our Father in heaven. There's a sensibleness to this whole thing, that makes it not have to be this scary, unpredictable thing that hangs over our heads at all times. All right, Rob and then Mickey, and then we're going to move on to the other topic.
Just not to unpack. Really, the great comfort is that all expectations outcomes. I don't think that's true. I mean, it's true what God has laid out, but for somebody going through that, it's not. How many times have we heard, why me? Why is this happening to me?
Oh.
If we were made clear, we would know why. Sometimes I think, okay, we have to be careful about these statements because we go, oh, you should be, no. Because the reality is, my experience has been, a lot of people go, I have no idea why me? Why am I sick? Why I have this disease? Why am I suffering? God's word can help in that, but they're not clear. I mean, they are.
Well,
God's word is
all right, in fairness, what I'm hearing you say makes me feel like I need to clarify this. When I talk about the wrath of God in this context, I'm talking about divine judgment, not necessarily about suffering that we experience on this side. Because I think you're right when it comes to suffering. I don't think necessarily it's for sure not that when it comes to suffering, right? Because look at Job, and Job's 3 friends come to him as these lousy comforters, miserable comforters, Job actually says about them. They come to him and they go, listen, man, the reason you're suffering is because you knew what was good and you obviously didn't do it. You're evil in some way, and that's why all these bad things have happened to you. And it's not the case when it comes to suffering. But in the grand scheme of the end of time and the end of you and the judgment day and all that kind of stuff, I do think the comfort against fearing the wrath of God on that day is the fact that he's given it to us, and I think that's the thing that helps us to not fear it, at least not in the paranoia and in the unpredictable kind of sense of fearing it, but it helps us to fear it in a respect kind of way, which is good. Okay, Mickey.
Real quick.
You get to be the last word.
Why do you obey the gospel? Well, I want to go to heaven. I love the Lord, but I don't want to go to heaven.
Yeah.
The wrath of God is a motivating factor.
Yeah.
Paul said, knowing therefore the fear of the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
or the terror of some translations,
Mm-hmm.
we persuade men.
Yep.
So it's not just something that governs my life, but it should be a motivation to try to help others.
That's exactly right. And lest any of you have ever sat in the room and heard someone say, like me perhaps, it's not healthy for us to be motivated by fear when we obey the gospel. We should be motivated by the love of God. It's both. I'm sorry that I've said that in the past. It wasn't in this room at least, okay? But it's both. Healthy understanding of both will get us where we need to go with God. All right, Josh, you get to be the last word.
And just to clarify that point, maybe one step further, is it's not necessarily there's a consequence thing, there's a love thing that's all encompassing. There's a God's way thing. You have to study
Yeah.
the whole of both truths
Yep.
to understand the point that we're talking.
Yep. The genius and the power of the and, not or. So yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. Let's talk then about the next lesson. And I actually don't mind this topic. I would enjoy us staying on this topic for a good while longer, but I want to try to get, again, as much as we can cover. So let's talk about the providence of God with the time that we have left this morning. When you hear that phrase, somebody give me a definition of what the providence of God means and entails, however you want to do it. Give me what you know from your bank of knowledge that phrase is talking about.
The way I always look at it is the providence of God.
Okay.
And it's Him providing the knowledge and providing the understanding that we need in order to follow to understand that point that we're talking.
Okay. So it's about Him providing something, and in your case, you're saying it's about Him providing the knowledge and the guidance that we need to know Him and seek Him. Okay. I'm gonna go with that. There's more, and Gary's got the rest of it. No, Gary's got the next piece of it. How about that?
I have something that I think of. Joseph is providence.
Okay. Yeah. In what way?
First of all, his brothers did a lot of bad things. They sent him off to be in Egypt. Joseph could have said, oh, why me? Why am I the only one,
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
He relied on God. He looked to God no matter what was going on in his life. In the end, he tells his brothers, God saw them
Mm-hmm.
and he provided.
Yeah, near as I can remember it, his phrase to them is, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, that many people should be saved this day. Genesis 50. So yeah. Okay, good. That's a good way to talk about it. Connecting it to the story of Joseph is a great connection there. Okay? Other ways of describing what providence is and does. Ryan?
I think of it as an after the fact thing.
Okay.
Like being able to see the hand of God after the fact
Yep.
rather than during.
Yep.
The Red Sea's parted, there's really God's presence. But like in Joseph's case, who knows why he ended up in prison, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you look backwards, you see that path.
Okay. Ryan makes a very helpful distinction right there with the now versus back then type of thinking. Okay. That's a very helpful distinction. And yeah, I'm just going to go with that. That was really good. And I'm going to come back to something else that both of you are getting close to, but nobody said it directly just yet. Anybody else want to throw one more in here?
I will throw another one.
Okay.
And it's an example of how I've heard it used. I was in the parking lot. God provided me a parking lot.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the providence of
Okay. Yeah. I have a buddy that tells about this one day. He, on those same lines, he went to Krispy Kreme, and he knew that it wasn't a good idea, like health-wise, to go in and get a dozen Krispy Kremes. And so he said, I prayed to God, if you want me to have a Krispy Kreme today, then open up a spot right in front of the front door for me. And if it doesn't open up, then I'll know it's not your will. And on the 8th trip around the building, that spot opened up, and he knew. Okay. All right, good. Now, nobody has said it directly here, what I think is the core element, the key element of understanding providence, so I'm going to get to it in just a second. But Gary's actually giving us one of the warnings that I want to make on the next slide, because I think there's a balancing act that we have to do with this topic, okay? And I hope I'm going to have time to get to all of it. But here's the key element that I think we're missing so far. When we talk about providence, we're talking about God doing his will through natural means, okay? And again, I think you understood that. I heard it implied in the way that those comments were being made just now. But that's the thing that I want to make sure that we articulate very clearly this morning, that when we talk about providence, we're talking about him doing his will and his work through natural, normal happenings on this earth, okay? Like parking spots, okay? I'm not saying that's exactly a great example there, but I am saying it's that sort of realm that we're talking about when we discuss the difference between providence and miracles. Now, Ryan gave us a great example of this. There is a difference, a huge difference, in fact, between miracles and providence. Both are the acting will of God. So there's the similarity. Both are God doing something for somebody. They are both the acting will of God. But the difference comes down to largely two things. Number one, hindsight versus right now, like Ryan said. And number two, is it a natural event or a supernatural event? Because let's be honest, not everything that God does is supernatural. He created the natural world, and sometimes he works within the framework he created to get things done. And that's the kind of thing that we're describing when it comes to providence. And so, a couple examples just to show you the wide gulf between these two ideas, even though they both mean God is active in the world. When we talk about miracles, we're talking about things like the crossing of the Red Sea, okay? The crossing of the Red Sea, you're standing on the bank and you're watching the sea open up in front of you. That is not the providence of God. That is a miracle happening right there. Then you're in a crowd of 5,000 plus people, and there's one meal available for all 5,000 plus of those people. And Jesus is feeding everybody through the hands of these 12 apostles being sent out all through the crowd. And you're sitting there watching that and going, okay, this didn't just happen to happen this way. This is a genuine miracle being done on this occasion, which is why they get so enamored with him and think he's the new Moses in the rest of that chapter, you know. But so that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about the crossing of the Red Sea. And by the way, I called them wonders right here. That's a little reference to the calling of Moses that we talked about last Sunday morning. God says to Moses, I will do my wonders toward and among the people of Egypt, and they will know who I am, you know. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when it comes to miracles, okay? When it comes to providence, though, we're talking about the kind of thing that's similar to Joseph and Esther. I actually think Esther may be the very best example of this, because Esther's example is the writing of Esther. Let me put it that way. The writing of Esther is unique in the Bible. Why? What's the distinguishing feature that makes it different from almost every other writing? Exactly. There is no mention of God, okay? Now, let me ask you a question with a very obvious answer. Is God at work in the book of Esther? Every single page, and powerfully, I would say. So here's the question. How can the writer get away with not mentioning him if he is at work in every single page? You're right, but don't you feel kind of bad saying it that way? He said, because you don't need to. You don't need to mention him. Now, I think what Mickey means by that is you don't need to mention him because it's so obvious that that's got to be God at work. It was all so perfectly synchronized and laid out and beyond the scope of any of those humans that it had to be a divine intervention. I agree. But here's the other side of that same thought. If you just had that story, nothing that requires God happens in that story. All of it together requires God. But no single event requires the magnificent wonder-working power of God on any given moment. Esther is in the right place at the right time. They say the right words to the right people. The right outcomes are happen for the right nation. It's all just natural processes there. It's a natural understanding of politics and people moving and all that kind of stuff that leads to the good outcome that is the book of Esther, and that is God saving his people, okay? It's God at work saving his people through Esther, but he does it all through the most natural means, so much so that the writer of the book didn't even have to put his name on it. Didn't even have to put God's name on it, you know? And so that's what's really cool about this idea of providence, is that God is clearly working, but he is working within the framework of the natural world as he created it. So, yes?
Could it, I don't know, I was just looking up the definition. It doesn't say anything about the natural, it's just the timing for the future. Could it be one of those, all, where is there, but, you
Yes.
know, all providence is not, okay, help me.
Yeah.
You know, all miracles are providence, but not all providence is done through miracles.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
I don't see the distinction between the two. I do think that it doesn't always have to be through miracles, but I do think that it's God's providence still through miracles.
Yeah, that's fair. That's totally fair as a way to say that. I think just in the interest of not using the word miracle unfairly, we've sort of drifted to where we mean providence means one and miracle means the other. But you're right. Providence is the big category. Miracle is the supernatural section of that category. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think she's right about that. All right, Dad, Gary, go. Let's do that.
Doesn't this actually also play out in some songs in terms of showing us what love is?
Oh, mm-hmm,
Yet God is never mentioned.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So you see this idea,
The other book where God is never mentioned, by the way.
you
Yeah.
know, that you've got this providence of God playing out between two lovers,
Uh-huh.
and yet we see the relationship that we have with God.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and this is one of those topics that when you start to see the biblical story through this filter, it's genuinely every page. Every page has some element of this concept at work. Gary, what were you going to say? But that's a good observation there. Yeah, there's another good example. Okay, not necessarily miraculous, right? Except for the voice of God speaking to stop Abraham, but the provision for what comes next. Where does Abraham's sacrifice come from? Genesis 22. He doesn't end up killing his son. Where does the sacrifice come from? That never happens. No, that totally happens, doesn't it? You know? And God uses that as his way of providing what's needed there. So yeah, Rob?
I think it's interesting in the story of Esther that Mordecai recognized that God is active, and he reminds Esther, you have a purpose. You may not see it right now, but he was aware God is active right now. And then in the story of Joseph, I don't recall any statements or things being said during that whole ordeal until Joseph looked back and said, now I see. But so I think it's important that we study this and realize God is active
All the time.
all the time.
Yep. All the time. Okay, now let me go ahead and make my caveat here, okay? Because I'm watching the clock real closely here. Let me go ahead and make my caveat, okay? I think it's also important that along these lines we acknowledge God's providence, which we are trying to do in this class. It's important that we acknowledge God's providence in our lives when hindsight shows it to us, like we hit the end of Joseph's story and he sees it behind him, behind him on the timeline. I think it's just important, though, that we have at least a little reminder here, kind of like Gary's point about the parking spot, that we acknowledge the providence of God in ways that are thoughtful. We're actually thinking it through, okay? And here's the warning that I want to make about that is, I want us to be wise about stating things that we don't actually know. I'm not saying that you should never acknowledge the providence of God. You should. But let's just have a little thoughtful, slow wisdom to think to ask if we're saying things we don't actually know to be true. Okay, here's the way that somebody said it. Our response to providence should be that we are always open to thankfulness, but never too bold to say that we can see the invisible. And the invisible in that sentence is capitalized. Okay, it's God. So we are grateful for what he has done, but not so bold to say that we see perfectly that which is invisible, okay? And so just a couple of little phrases just to think about. I'm not saying never say these, but I'm saying think about it if you're going to use these phrases. I hear people say this one all the time. Oh man, this is a good thing happening for me. This is a total God thing. What we mean by that is, this is the providence of God at work, and I can totally tell God wants me to do this. He's drawing me into this. Think. I'm just encouraging you. Think before you say that. I'm not saying don't say it. Just think before you do. Second one here, this person in my life is a godsend. Well, that's actually, if you think about what we're saying there, that's a statement of the providence of God. So again, I'm not saying don't use it because Paul uses it. Peter uses that sort of language, okay? They talk about the people that were a gift from God when they came to me. That may be actually true. I'm just encouraging us to be thinking when we use these kinds of words. And then this other one, everything happens for a reason. Okay, first of all, that's not exactly what Romans 8:28 says, even though that's what we kind of think Romans 8:28 says. We need to be careful with Romans 8:28. Secondly, though, sometimes things happen for a reason, and sometimes the reason is a very bad reason. And what we mean by this is everything happens for a reason because God wants to only do good things in my life. He wants to only make things pleasant for me. It all happens for a reason. Not necessarily the case. Let's just make sure we're thinking. If we're going to use these phrases, let's make sure we use them with some wisdom. All right, Ben, what you got?
I really appreciate that. As was mentioned about Mordecai,
Mm-hmm.
great word, perhaps.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Paul used that as well.
Yeah.
Great word for us. We really don't know.
Yeah.
Acquaintance considering moving to another state.
It always happens with moving to another state, choosing a college, or finding another job. Yep.
And there was a dream involved.
Yep.
So we need to be careful. Our thoughts, God's thoughts are not our thoughts.
That's exactly right.
Our thoughts can be presented, our thoughts, not necessarily. When people were spoken in the Bible, it was real clear.
Yep. Mm-hmm. A lot of good wisdom in what Ben just said right there. Again, I'm not in any way saying we should not acknowledge the providence of God. I'm saying that we should speak with wisdom when we do. That's what I'm trying to get across right there. And by the way, add to that, and I saw you, add to that, it's important that we are thankful to God for all of his good gifts. And I think when it comes to acknowledging his providence, that's the most important and most obvious way for us to respond. If something good has happened in your life, thank God for that good thing. That's not the same as telling everyone that you know, I know what God is up to right now. I can see the invisible working in my life, and it's this way, and this is what he wants, and this is what he's chosen. It's not necessarily the same thing. Hindsight and gratitude go real well together, okay? And let's just make sure that that's something that we're also locked into. Again, none of these are hard, fast rules. I'm not talking about rules. I'm talking about wisdom here. And you know how that works. All right, Mickey, what you got?
In reference to the wisdom of what you said, Ecclesiastes, of all places.
Yeah.
3, verse 11. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set eternity in their heart. Yet so,
that man
Not
cannot
know
find
out.
the work that God has done from the beginning, even unto the end.
Yep,
We don't know everything.
that's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly right. Good wisdom there. Ben, one more.
Other thought, in addition to wisdom and integrity,
Mm.
there's actually a situation where my father in counseling a lady who was involved in some mission trips, and all of a sudden she came back home instead of being on that mission field. The reason was God's will. In the things were asked, what really happened there, she actually confessed. Well, with tears, said, well, sorry, but I found that when I use God's name, I kind of get what admonition, we need to be careful. Involve God in life.
Wisdom. Wisdom would prevent that sort of thing. Good, solid, biblical wisdom would prevent that sort of thing. Okay, so last thing here. Okay, providence defined, providence acknowledged, providence enjoyed. Here's the last one for today. Okay, as I said, the response that I know we should make to providence of God is gratitude. And gratitude is what helps us to enjoy all of God's good things. So whether his gifts are big or little, whether they are exciting or mundane, whether they are immediate or they have been building for a very long time until we receive them fully, whether they are the things we expect God to give us or the things we never expected God to give us, we are grateful for what he does and for who he is. Okay? And I just think this is a really important place, actually, for us to end this entire quarter studying the nature of God. Let's just end on this idea of being truly grateful for not only what he does, but for who he is. And for just the fact that in everything we have learned about him, we can, number one, trust him. And number two, we can know that he loves us. And this great God, with all of these magnificent conceptual ideas defining who he is, has chosen to love us. What an incredible, incredible gift. So let's be grateful for it. Thank you so much for studying through this with me this quarter. I've enjoyed teaching it. Hope it's been beneficial for you.